It's not always easy to honor a difficult man, and Moses Asch was all of that. Tony Seeger, who now oversees Asch's huge recorded legacy as curator of Smithsonian Folkway's records, wondered as a boy if his Uncle Pete might know two Mo Asches. The one that brought him home smiling about this wonderful man who kept so much American folk music in print when others wouldn't, and the Mo Asch who set him fuming and cursing. Mo Asch is a man worthy of honoring, but it's impossible to honor him without saying that this was indeed a difficult man, a stubborn man. It's not merely mentioned by those who knew him well, it's usually the first thing mentioned about him. It's also impossible to avoid this because only a man just like Moses Asch could have or would have done what he did, and what he did was remarkable. What he did was unprecedented in the brief history of recorded music. He compiled, as Smithsonian Magazine put it, the largest collection of folk music records ever made available to the buying public. His storefront record company, Folkway, released 2,168 titles, and he kept every one of them in print, although scarcely more than 200 of them ever turned a real profit. To Asch, he was not compiling a record catalog or artist roster, but a library of human sound. When asked why he insisted on keeping even his most arcane, obscure titles available, he liked to say, "Do you delete the letter Q from the dictionary because you don't use it as much as the others?" Stubborn man, stubborn man. It's easy to get lost in the sheer wonder of what he released. Eccentricities such as the sound of North American frogs, train noises, spoken word titles like Bertolt Brecht's testimony before the House Un-American Activities Committee, interviews with Albert Einstein, Eleanor Roosevelt, Martin Luther King, poetry from Allen Ginsberg, and Langston Hughes, readings from P.G. Wodehouse, Gertrude Stein, and Mo Asch's own father, the novelist Sholem Asch. But it wasn't finding the obscure or the eccentric that drove Asch's engine. It was a passionate desire to compile as vast a catalog of the human experience as possible. "I'm trying to document as much of contemporary life as exists that is able to be recorded," he told Audio Magazine. His catalog includes vital jazz recordings by such legends as Duke Ellington, Jelly Roll Morton, Mary Lou Williams, James P. Johnson, and Coleman Hawkins. He produced a pioneering series of electronic music records, including seminal work by John Cage. But his greatest legacy is his recording of folk music, both of artistic giants like Pete Seeger, Woody Guthrie, and Leadbelly, and traditional field recordings of the music from hundreds of the world's ethnic cultures. Folkway's records boast 100 records of traditional music from the Caribbean, 35 Native American recordings, and another 30 from indigenous South American cultures, music from Zulus and Siberian minstrels, Japanese folk music, and play party songs from the Georgia Sea Islands. During the ugly, dark days of the blacklist, Mo Asch kept American folk music on record when other labels lacked the courage, often inventing projects to keep great artists like Woody, Pete, and Leadbelly busy. From that came some of the most important American folk music recordings ever made: Guthrie's children's songs, Seeger's America's Favorite Ballads, Leadbelly's Last Sessions. Beginning with Leadbelly's classic children's record, and continuing with the inspired children's music of Woody Guthrie, Ella Jenkins, Pete Seeger, and others, Asch and Folkway's records practically invented the modern children's music market. Folkway's records, with their serious look and copious notes, heavily influenced a new generation of urban folk artists and fans in the 60s. Samuel Charter's anthology, Elizabeth Cotton and Joseph Spence's marvelous finger-picking guitar styles, vintage country blues from such giants as Big Bill Broonzy, Muddy Waters, and Sonny Terry and Brownie McGee. Folkway's Broadside series of topical songs did much to implant a progressive edge on the personality of the commercial folk revival. The sheer weight and black leather-like look of Folkway's records, along with their long, scholarly notes, told new fans immediately that this was serious stuff. That was no accident, but a prime example of Asch's unique blend of frugality, idealism, and market savvy. I felt I had an obligation, not just to the recording, but to the creation of a package that represents the contents. He said, "It had to have a look of intellectualism. If it was blues, I had to show that this black country musician had value." From the beginning, each record had lyrics and descriptive notes. They were talking books. Asch's practical side was working here as well. Since some of his best clients were libraries and schools, he often packed suitcases full of Folkway's titles and trooped off to librarians or teachers' conventions, and in so doing, did much to foster the creative thinking that helped spawn the independent record revolution of the 70s and 80s. If the commercial market's not buying, find who is. Go there and then show them your stuff. Asch saved Woody Guthrie's landmark album of Dust Bowl ballads from almost certain extinction, igniting just one of the controversies that flamed around Asch all his life and made him the kind of man we now honor for his massive life's work. Not all of Asch's records were, in fact, Asch's records. He sometimes took records others had let slip out of print and re-released them. During World War II, for example, record companies responded to the military need for metal, copper, shellac by destroying thousands of old master recordings. Much as they did with the alleged vinyl shortage of the mid-1970s, big labels used this as an excuse to streamline their catalogs and doom many classic titles to the dustbin. They were destroying property which they claimed was their own, Asch said in a 1977 Sing Out interview. "I always claimed that what they were doing was destroying the culture. So I started to reissue some of the records which I thought ought to be preserved. I was called a pirate. They said I was taking property that belonged to a record company, but actually it is our right to know, to give people what they need to know." Many vintage American recordings were surely saved because of Asch's piracy, including Harry Smith's priceless epic collection of authentic American folk recordings. RCA had recorded Guthrie's Dust Bowl ballads in 1940, and by 1947, Guthrie feared it would be destroyed, and he begged Asch to re-release it. Since it was out of print, Asch didn't feel the need to bother with formalities, like actually obtaining permission from RCA. He simply re-released it. 20 years later, RCA discovered what happened and said merely, "It's okay with us." Stubborn man. Stubborn man. Moses Asch was born in 1905, the son of the famed Jewish novelist Sholem Asch. A strong literary sense always informed Mo Asch's musical work. "I'm not interested in music per se," he said, "but the literature of it." He was first drawn to folk music when he came across a copy of folklorist John Lomax's book of cowboy songs. "The introduction by Theodore Roosevelt," he said, "guided me through life because it said that folklore and songs are the cultural expression of a people." An early interest in electronics and sound engineering, including some important work developing the condenser microphone, led to his record career. It's a typical Asch tale. In 1939, many labels dropped their ethnic and international records as a mounting war effort created shellac shortages. There was a clamor for Jewish records in New York City, and Jewish folk songs by the Begelman sisters was quietly released on Asch Records. Mo Asch moved through several little companies to finally found Folkways in 1947. When others were afraid to record blues giant and twice-convicted murderer Hughie Ledbetter, Asch said, "Of course I will." In a brilliant marketing stroke, however, Asch released a delightful record of Leadbelly's adorable children's songs. It helped make the folk genius a star, and Asch a bona fide record executive. Stubborn man. In creating Folkway's records during the folk-hostile 1950s, Asch did much to inspire the aesthetics and business ways of today's independent, some say stubborn, folk market. He created his own marketing niches, not only in libraries and schools, but by urging artists to sell their records at concerts. Many of the first miles of today's complex independent distribution network were paved by Asch. His aesthetics about recording were also profoundly influential. He was not after the prettiest record, the most accessible or airplayable, but the most honest. He staunchly refused to use multi-track recording, even well into the 1980s, though he did begrudgingly release some records that had been made that way, as long as, he said, these people have something worthwhile to say. "What I'm interested in," he said, "is what intellectual knowledge do we get from a record, rather than, is this a super high fidelity or does it reach 10,000 cycles?" His flat approach to recording, whenever possible using only one microphone per artist, mixed with his frugal record pressing budget, often obscured his studio mastery. As Smithsonian Folkways returns to the original masters for remixing to CD, they're amazed by the quality, the honesty, and the intimacy of the sound. "It's like lifting a veil," said Tony Seeger. "Some of those old acetates are just stunning." In remastered CD form, Guthrie's charm leaps off the disc. Leadbelly's sophisticated 12-string power is heard as never before, and Seeger sings more sweetly than ever. The result is a powerful legacy for us now. Great American music masters recorded precisely as they performed. Likewise, when folklorists and collectors approached him about releasing their field recordings, he didn't look for listener-friendly sounds, but asked about authenticity. Checked to see if this culture, this ceremony, this cycle of ballads had been preserved on record before. His passion for inclusiveness, for documenting as much human culture and experience as possible, impressed folklorists and musicians alike with the pricelessness of the heritage we call folk music. And if he financed his work by conserving on such frou-frous as paying artist royalties, no artist worried that he was driving a big fancy car at their expense. All his money, like all his talent, energy, passion, and devotion, went right back into those thick black records. All 2,168 of them. All still in print. This is my main criterion, he said. Does a guy actually mean what he says? Or is it just something he thinks he can make a couple of bucks out of? The guy has to live it and feel it, and has to say, I'm being browbeaten by society and I've got to get it out of my guts. Don't think the culture dies, he said shortly before his death. It's just that there are so many distractions. Today, the kids, instead of singing or becoming part of the community, are playing video games. They are isolated. They think they can live without knowing about their cultural background. I couldn't live that way. This is the thing which guides me, knowing where I fit. I'm safe. I'm on the ground. They are not. I try to convince them that they need ground in order to be safe, too. Moses Asch died in 1986, carefully stipulating that anyone who took responsibility for any of his records had to take responsibility for all of them, along with keeping his entire dictionary of human sound available to the listening public. Even now, he's a very stubborn man.
I never had a barrel of money. I never had a ruby red ring. All I ever had was you, babe, to sit and listen to me sing. I've got those blues, those barrel of money blues. I never had a barrel of money. I never had a big Cadillac. All I ever had was you, babe, and that's a fact. I've got those blues, those barrel of money blues.